So when I think about opening oysters, I think right back to my grandfather and his 7 brothers opening oysters in the Georges River. They'd go out to the mangroves, pick oysters off the mangroves and the rocks, open them, put them in bottles, take them to the train station in the afternoon to feed the commuters coming back from Sydney. And since then, we've moved on to having a processing depot in Queensland and in Sydney, where we ship our oysters from the farm, open them en masse, and then ship them out to restaurants and then to the public. What we want to do is we want to show you guys now how to open oysters in your own home, in your own hand. When we're looking at an oyster, there are 2 main components that we need to understand in the structure of an oyster. One is that every oyster has a hinge and every oyster has an adductor muscle. Our aim when we're trying to open an oyster is to either break that hinge or to sever that adductor muscle. The adductor muscle on every Sydney Rock oyster is here on the right-hand side of the oyster. It attaches between the top shell and the bottom shell of the oyster. Our job when we're opening an oyster is either to cut that adductor muscle or to break the hinge point, which is just here. The safest way and the easiest way for a beginner, I believe, to open an oyster is to place your oyster on a bench, place a T-tail over the top, and then with your oyster knife, you want to place that oyster knife in the base hinge of the oyster, and you're trying to lever it in just enough and with just enough pressure to get the knife point located and wedged inside. And once it's stuck there, we can then twist the oyster knife that allows us to pop that hinge. Once that hinge point has been popped, then we're sliding the knife along the top shell of the oyster so it'll then cut the adductor muscle. Once the adductor muscle's cut, you can remove the lid, place it to the side, bring your knife back in and cut the adductor muscle on the underside of the oyster. Then we can turn our oyster around and present the condition of the oyster. The next method we'll look at is holding the oyster in your hand, but with a similar approach going through the base of the oyster. So if I'm sitting around at a party opening oysters around the fire, I hold the oyster in my hand and I take the same approach, placing the knife in the back hinge, applying just enough pressure to get the knife stuck in the back hinge, and again wiggling that blade into the hinge point to get that point where we can then pop the oyster. And then we twist, pops the hinge. Once that's cracked, we then slide the knife along the top shell of the oyster, trying to cut that adductor muscle. And once that adductor muscle is cut open, see there where it was previously attached, put the lid to the side and then cut that adductor muscle off the bottom shell and then rotate our oyster to show the condition of the oyster. Now for a particularly stubborn or hard oyster, Sydney Rock Oysters can be grown at 5 and 6 years of age and they produce a really tough, hard shell. We can approach them by, instead of trying to crack that back hinge, we can approach it by trying to cut that adductor muscle first. So to do that, we need to pierce the shell in the region of the adductor muscle, slide the oyster knife down beside the shell, cut the adductor muscle, and then break the hinge. Place the oyster knife here on the edge of the oyster, wiggle it in, and get your oyster knife in to that break in the oyster. Then we can twist and slide the knife in to cut the top adductor muscle. Once the adductor muscle is cut, we keep leveraging the top shell up and then break the hinge with our hands. Cut the adductor muscle on the bottom part of the shell and share amongst your friends. So while it might seem a little bit intimidating at first, by following these simple steps, everyone can enjoy freshly shucked oysters in your own home.